The first thing I remember is the color of the light. It was thin and washed out the way dusk looks when it filters through bare, wet branches and never quite reaches the ground. There was a smell in the air I still can't describe without my throat tightening, sharp chemical clinging to the back of my nose like it wanted to stay there. Somewhere close by, something metallic tapped soft and irregular like a spoon nudged against a pot by a trembling hand. The ground under my boots felt uneven and slick, a mix of damp leaves and cold stone, and every time I shifted my weight, I heard the faint crumble of soil giving way. Smoke hung low, not in a thick cloud, but in thin gray ribbons that threaded through the trees and refused to rise. In the middle of it all, there was a small, stubborn flame licking at blackened wood, throwing just enough light to make the surrounding darkness feel deeper. I stood there breathing that harsh air, listening to the tiny sounds against the enormous quiet, and understood that whatever this place had been before, it wasn't just a campsite anymore. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that, my world was much smaller and gentler. My days in Asheville revolved around the glow of a computer screen, the hum of an old refrigerator in our kitchen, and the way the morning light crept across the hardwood floors of our little rental house. I'd sit at a wobbly dining table I pretended was a desk coffee cooling beside my keyboard, while Daniel clattered around in the bathroom getting ready for his shift at the pharmacy. The smell of his aftershave would drift down the hallway clean, slightly medicinal, and mix with the scent of dark roast coffee and the faint trace of last night's dinner. Outside, delivery trucks growled past on our street tires, crunching over the gravel shoulder, and somewhere a dog barked in that bored, half-hearted way that tells you nothing much is happening. Asheville in early fall has a softness to it that's hard to explain unless you've watched the seasons there for years. The heat backs off, the air clears, and the mornings start just cool enough that you feel that first hint of breath on your skin when you open the front door. On our block, you could step out onto the porch and hear screen doors slam. Lawn mowers start up and neighbors calling across yards, all under the faint hiss of cicadas lingering a little longer than they should. Sunlight slid through the trees at a lower angle, catching on spider webs stretched between porch railings and the faded wind chimes next door. The smell of wood smoke started appearing in the evenings, one house at a time, as people tested their fireplaces after a long summer. Daniel loved that shift in the air. He'd lean against the kitchen counter in his pale blue work shirt tie, not yet tightened, and watch the weather forecast on his phone with the same seriousness other people reserved for breaking news. The screen's cold white light reflected off his glasses as he scrolled through temperature charts and cloud maps narrating the coming week as if he could bend it to his will. Cooler nights, he'd say, tapping the screen. Clear on Saturday. Maybe fog up high, but nothing serious. His voice always came out even and careful, but there was a little lift at the end of his sentences when he talked about the mountains. It was the same lift I heard when he told patients their prescriptions were ready and he could help them feel better. Our weekends, when his schedule allowed, had their own quiet rhythm. Fridays blurred into a kind of soft anticipation. I'd wrap up design work as the afternoon light turned golden behind the blinds, the clack of my keyboard slowing as I watched the clock inch toward the time he'd come home. The house would fill with the sound of his boots on the steps, the jingle of his keys, the familiar squeak of the front doorknob that I kept promising to fix. He'd walk in smelling faintly of hand sanitizer and paper dust from the stacks of boxes at the pharmacy, shrug off his jacket and kiss my cheek in that absent-minded way of people who know they don't have to ask if they're welcome. By the time dinner was over, something simple pasta or a stir-fry, we made half listening to the evening news, the kitchen table would turn into command central. Daniel would spread out trail maps, folding and refolding them along worn creases, while I loaded a roll of film into my old camera and checked my backpack for batteries. The overhead light hummed softly above us, casting a yellow circle on the paper as his pen traced lines along ridges and valleys. Outside cars rolled by less frequently, their headlights sweeping briefly over our curtains, and the steady chorus of insects thickened in the cooling air. He was the planner between us. He kept a small notebook just for hikes, columns of dates, mileage, weather notes, what had gone right, what he'd change next time. The paper was rough under his fingers, corners bent and darkened from use. "We'll go from the gap to the ridge," he'd say, tapping a spot on the map. "Out and back, nothing crazy. First day to the Balds. Second day, we stay high or drop down a bit if the wind's bad." He would note the time of sunset, the expected wind chill, small streams where we could refill water. I'd nod along, mostly thinking about the way the light would look on the open slopes, how the grass would move in the breeze, and whether I'd be able to catch it on film. Looking back, there were all these tiny gestures that feel heavier now than they did then. The way he'd double-check the batteries in his headlamp, clicking it on and off until he was satisfied with the brightness. How he'd fold an extra pair of socks and tuck them into an outer pocket just in case, brushing his fingers over the fabric as if committing its location to memory. The slight frown line that would appear between his eyebrows when I joked about us just winging it this time, and how he'd force a smile but his eyes would linger on the map a little longer. At the time, they were just quirks, the harmless habits of a careful man. Years later, they feel like small warning bells I was too relaxed to hear. Our families had their own opinions about our mountain weekends. My sister Karen would call on Thursday nights, her voice crackling slightly through the cheap speaker of my phone as I sat on the back steps, cool concrete under my legs. I'd listen to her talk about grading papers, school politics, and the latest parent complaint, while the smell of damp leaves drifted up from the narrow strip of yard. When I mentioned our plans, there'd be a beat of silence, the faint sound of her exhaling into the receiver. "You two are careful, right?" she'd always ask, her tone light but edged with something firmer underneath. I'd laugh it off, say, "You know Daniel? He plans for the apocalypse just to buy groceries." Daniel's mom, Linda, was more direct. She'd sometimes call while he was at work, and I'd answer pacing slowly through the house with the phone tucked against my shoulder. Her voice carried that familiar mixture of warmth and worry softened by years of night shifts and emergencies. "Those mountains don't care how prepared you are," she liked to say. The line would buzz faintly in my ear as I stared out the front window at kids riding bikes up the street, their laughter bouncing off parked cars. "Promise me you'll listen to him when he says it's time to turn back." I always promised. At the time, the promise felt easy, almost abstract, like agreeing to wear a seatbelt in a parked car. We'd been out on short sections of the Appalachian Trail many times before, little weekend slices that started to run together in my memory. Damp soil underfoot, wooden shelters with their musty old smoke smell, faded signs pointing toward places that sounded more like stories than real locations. But that fall, there was one section Daniel kept coming back to, tapping it on the map like it was quietly calling his name. Carver's Gap to Grassy Ridge Bald. He liked how the route stayed high, how the open domes gave you those long sweeping views whenever the clouds cooperated. "It's classic," he said one night, his finger following the contour lines as the overhead light flickered slightly. 3 days, no huge climbs. Good way to celebrate surviving summer rush. The closer we got to October, the more the whole town seemed to lean into the change. Coffee shops downtown started offering pumpkin everything. The air in the grocery store parking lot felt cooler on my face when I pushed the cart back to the corral, the cart's wheels rattling over the cracks in the asphalt. In the evenings, as we drove home along residential streets, we'd see porches lined with mums and early pumpkins, their surfaces slick with dew when the temperature dropped. The sky shifted too. Sunsets stretched themselves out, painting long bands of pink and orange above the dark blue line of the mountains on the horizon. The hum of traffic along the interstate softened in my ears when we cracked the truck windows and let the cold air slip in. At home, the packing started in small, almost invisible ways. A pile of gear appeared in the corner of the living room, rolled sleeping bags with their straps snug against the nylon, a tent bag leaning like a thin, patient animal against the bookshelf. The sound of zippers became part of the background music of our evenings, along with the murmur of the TV and the steady tick of the kitchen clock. Daniel would sit cross-legged on the rug headlamp already on his forehead, like a crown checking the first aid kit, counting out pills into his palm. I'd stand at the sink, hands in warm, soapy water, listening to the rattle of pill bottles and the soft plastic crackle of zip-top bags. One night, the week before we planned to leave, a light rain tapped steadily against the windows, the drops spaced just far enough apart that you could hear each one on the glass. The air in the house felt a little cooler, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement and the neighbor's laundry detergent drifting in from the shared line out back. Daniel sat at the table with his notebook writing down times in his careful blocky handwriting. Drive to the trailhead. Start walking, expected arrival at the first overlook. I remember the smooth feel of the map under my fingertips as I traced our planned route, the paper slightly worn and warm from the heat of the overhead bulb. He circled the words Carver's Gap and Grassy Ridge, like they were part of a private equation only he could solve. That same night, my phone buzzed twice in a row on the table, skittering a little against the wood. Karen had sent a text. "Call me when you get a chance. Want to hear about this big hike?" I saw the preview flash across the screen while Daniel was talking about backup water sources, his finger landing on a small blue line running between contour lines. The glow of the phone's screen looked almost too bright against the warm yellow light in the room. I told myself I'd call my sister after we finished packing, after we watched a show, after I wasn't so tired. Then I turned the phone face down, and the room returned to its softer, older colors. He went to bed early that night, the mattress springs creaking gently as he shifted the faint rustle of blankets accompanying the steady rhythm of his breathing. I stayed up a little longer, rinsing the last dishes, wiping stray crumbs from the counter with a damp cloth that left a faint, sour smell of dish soap and old food in the air. When I finally switched off the kitchen light, the house dropped into a quieter, more fragile kind of darkness. A street lamp outside threw a pale cone of light across the curtains, and I could hear the distant hiss of a car on wet pavement somewhere beyond our block. Before I went to bed, I stood at the front window for a moment, fingertips resting against the cool glass. Across the street, one of our neighbors had forgotten to turn off their porch light. It burned steady and yellow against the damp night, casting a faint halo on the slick boards of their steps and the small puddle forming at the edge of their driveway. The air inside our house felt still, almost too still, as if everything were pausing for just a second longer than usual. I watched that lonely porch light glow in the drizzle, thought about nothing in particular, and told myself I was just tired. Then I let the curtain fall back into place, turned away from the window, and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, not yet understanding why that quiet, lingering light would stay with me for the rest of my life. I remember the moment the quiet routine of that weekend first bent out of shape. It was subtle, almost nothing at all, a small silence where there should have been a sound. Sunday evening light was slipping across our living room, turning everything a muted honey color when I glanced at the clock and thought he should have texted by now. It wasn't panic, not even close. Just a faint, misplaced pinch under my ribs like the air had shifted in the house. I rinsed off a plate, set it in the drying rack, and told myself not to be ridiculous. The mountains could slow you down. Fog rolled in. Hikers lost track of time. I'd said those same reassurances to other people over the years, never imagining I'd need to repeat them to myself. By 7, dusk had turned into a deeper bluish shade that brushed the tops of the trees outside our window. I tried calling him purely out of habit, thumb-tapping the icon without any real fear behind it. The ringtone echoed in the quiet kitchen, a soft, distant sound that barely filled the room, and then it went to voicemail. I smiled a little at the greeting he'd recorded months earlier, warm and slightly rushed the way he always sounded when he tried to get a message done in one take. I hung up and set the phone down. One missed call wasn't a sign of anything. Not with Daniel. He loved shutting out the world on the trail, letting his phone drop to the bottom of his pack while he let his mind settle. But a half hour later, I found myself staring at the screen again. A thin finger of cold air slipped in through the crack of the kitchen window, carrying the damp smell of fallen leaves, and in that moment something inside me tightened. I tried his number again. Same ring, same voicemail. The sound seemed louder this time, as if the phone itself was trying to convince me everything was still fine. I left a message light, joking, telling him dinner would be late if he didn't hurry home. My voice sounded normal, but my chest felt tight. The first real shiver of discomfort came when I walked outside to check the mailbox. The air had a bite to it, the kind that sinks just far enough into your skin to remind you autumn isn't fooling around anymore. I stood by the curb for a moment, listening to distant traffic, watching the faint glow of the street lamps flicker to life. I thought about how long it usually took him to hike back from the ridge, how he'd sometimes text me a photo of the view at sunset. I unlocked the mailbox, retrieved a handful of flyers, and stood there flipping through them with the distracted rhythm of someone trying to keep their mind occupied. Back inside the house felt too warm, too quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the low, constant buzz of the porch light outside, sounds I normally never noticed. I tried to read. I tried to watch something. My eyes kept flicking to the front window, half expecting to see headlights turn onto our street. By 10, the quiet had become a weight. I called again this time, letting the phone ring all the way through before the voicemail kicked in. The message I left wasn't as casual. My voice wavered on one word, I don't even remember which, but I heard it. The sound clung to me like a cold hand. I texted him twice, then again. Around 11, I called my sister. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and concern. The moment she said, "What's wrong? Something inside me cracked." I told her the timing didn't feel right, that he should have checked in by now, that there was no reason for silence. She tried to calm me, tried to pull me back into rational explanations. Dead battery, poor reception, a late campfire. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her voice. "Call me if you hear anything," she said, and in that quiet pause before she hung up, I realized she was afraid too. I didn't sleep at all that night. The house creaked in soft, uneven intervals, the way old homes do when the temperature drops, but each sound landed inside me like a small, sharp tap. I lay on the couch with the lamp on phone on my chest, staring at the ceiling and trying to steady my breathing. Every now and then, I would sit up convinced I'd heard a car in the driveway, but each time the window remained empty, just the steady glow of the street lamp casting a pale stripe across the room. By dawn, the world outside was washed in a soft gray, the sky stretching out in a thin layer of cloud that pressed down on the tops of the houses. I made coffee without tasting it, the heat from the mug warming my hands even as a cold knot settled low in my ribs. I knew I couldn't pretend this was normal anymore. Daniel didn't miss check-in times. He didn't ignore messages. Even on the longest hikes, he always found one small moment to send a quick, "all good." I told myself to wait until noon. That felt fair, reasonable. But by 9, I was pacing the living room, the sound of my own footsteps filling the house. My phone remained stubbornly silent. When I finally grabbed my keys and headed for the truck, the air outside smelled like wet earth and distant wood smoke, familiar scents that should have been comforting. Instead, they clung to my clothes like reminders of places he should have already left behind. The drive to the trailhead took over an hour, but it passed in a blur. My hands tightened around the wheel every time the road curved, gravel crackling beneath the tires whenever I pulled aside to let another car pass. Leaves skittered across the pavement in little rust-colored flurries, whipped up by the gusts that swept down from the higher ridges. As I climbed toward the gap, the air grew sharper, colder, carrying a faint metallic smell of rock and wind that reminded me of long hikes we'd taken together. I kept checking the rearview mirror as if he might somehow appear behind me on the road, smiling in that quiet way he did when he thought I worried too much. When I pulled into the parking area at Carver's Gap, the gravel crunched under the tires with a familiar sound. The lot was mostly empty. just a few vehicles scattered near the tree line, but his little silver sedan stood right where we'd left it 2 days earlier. Seeing it stopped me in my tracks. The windows were fogged slightly from the cold, the hood glistening with a thin layer of dew that hadn't yet burned off. For a few seconds I just sat there with the engine running, air from the vents filling the truck with a faint plastic smell, staring at his car. Everything about it felt wrong. I stepped out into the cold, the wind cutting across the ridge with a steady hiss that raised goosebumps on my arms. When I reached his car, the metal was chilled beneath my fingertips. I cupped my hands against the driver's side window and peered inside. Nothing was disturbed. The spare bag of warm clothes was still in the trunk where we'd tucked it. The seat was empty. His jacket wasn't there. The motel key lay exactly where he'd left it, in the glove compartment. The longer I stood there, the deeper the dread sank in. It was the kind of cold that settles into your bones, not from temperature, but from understanding. His car shouldn't have been there anymore. He should have been home. I tried calling him again, leaning against the door with the wind pushing gently at my back. The ringtone echoed against the open air, small and lonely. A pair of hikers walked past, boots thudding softly on the gravel, their breath visible in the cold morning. They gave me a polite nod before heading toward the trail, the sound of their footsteps fading into the brush. I wanted to ask them if they'd seen anyone, but the words wouldn't come. I walked up to the trailhead slowly, the wooden sign weathered from seasons of rain and sun. I traced the carved letters with my thumb, feeling the cool grooves beneath my skin. There was a shelter logbook in the metal box below the sign, its cover slightly damp from the previous night's fog. I flipped through it with shaking fingers until I reached the entry from 2 days earlier. His handwriting stood out, instantly clean, neat, deliberate. Carver's Grassy Ridge. Seeing those words plain and confident on the page made my knees weak. He had signed it the way he always did, without fuss. He had done everything right. And yet here I was, standing alone at the edge of an empty trail, clutching a logbook that gave me no comfort. The trail itself was quiet. The wind funneled through the gap with a low hum, carrying the smell of cold grass and damp soil. For a moment, I imagined stepping onto the path and calling his name until my voice cracked. I imagined finding him sitting on a rock, just a mile up, smiling sheepishly as he explained a wrong turn or a dead battery. But the air felt too heavy for hopeful fantasies. Something unseen, something I couldn't name, lurked behind the quiet. I walked back toward the parking area, each step slow and deliberate, the gravel shifting under my boots. I fumbled with my phone, trying to decide who to call first. My sister, his mother, the sheriff's office. The cold wind made my eyes water, but even then I couldn't tell what was weather and what was fear. As I approached his car again, a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the lot. A sheriff's cruiser rolled in slowly, tires crunching the gravel in a steady rhythm. It pulled up beside my truck and came to a gentle stop. The engine clicked as it cooled, and the deputy stepped out, smoothing a hand over his hat before tucking it under his arm. He looked at me for a long moment, patient, solemn, waiting for me to speak first. By then, the sun had slipped behind a thick bank of cloud, leaving the ridge in a muted gray that made every shadow stretch a little farther than it should. I opened my mouth to greet him, but no sound came out. All I could hear was the wind moving through the grass and the distant rattle of the cruiser's radio whispering static across the cold morning air. The morning the search truly began felt colder than it should have for early fall. Even now, the memory sits inside me with a kind of metallic chill, the kind that settles into your jaw and makes your teeth ache. The deputy who'd arrived the day before stood beside me near the trailhead, his breath showing in thin white streams as he spoke into his radio. Behind him, the cruiser's lights pulsed slow and steady, the red glow reflecting off the damp gravel like small moving embers. More trucks rolled into the lot, County Vehicles Park Service rigs, volunteer SUVs with fogged windows, and one by one people stepped out, pulling on jackets, tightening bootlaces, rubbing their hands together to fight the cold breeze curling off the ridge. The sharp scent of pine and diesel mixed in the air, and it struck me then harsher than it had the day before. This wasn't just me looking for someone I loved. This was an official search. Something had gone terribly wrong. They set up a folding table near the edge of the lot, its metal legs clattering against uneven ground. A ranger spread a large laminated map across it, weighing down the corners with stones. The map's glossy surface reflected the weak morning light, creating small bright patches that danced whenever the wind lifted the paper. Radios crackled close by, voices sharp-clipped all business. I stood a few steps back, hands shoved deep into my pockets, the cold biting at the skin of my wrists where my sleeves fell short. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it felt like it was echoing inside me. One of the search managers approached a man with a lined face and a calm voice that carried the steady authority of someone who had done this too many times. He asked me to walk him through Daniel's route again, where he planned to camp, the timing he'd written down, which side trails he'd mentioned. I answered everything I could, my voice shaking despite my attempts to speak evenly. The man nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth pulled tight with that look search coordinators get when they're trying to be hopeful without making promises. "We'll start with the main line along the ridge," he said, tapping the map with a thick finger. "Then we'll push outward." Volunteers arrived in small clusters, locals with walking sticks, college kids with backpacks too new, older hikers who knew these mountains as well as their own backyards. They whispered among themselves as they gathered, their voices blending with the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I caught pieces of conversation drifting past me. Fog rolled in fast yesterday. Wind was nasty up top. Hope they just lost the trail. Those words, "just lost the trail," felt like a rope I tried to hang on to, even as it slipped through my fingers. By mid-morning, the first teams moved out. I watched them head toward the trailhead in lines of 2 and 3 boots thumping softly against the packed dirt radios, clipped to shoulder straps, orange vests bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. A pair of search dogs strained at their harnesses, noses low to the ground, tails stiff with focus. Their handlers murmured commands in steady tones, the leashes tugging tight whenever the dogs caught even a hint of a scent. I stepped back as they passed the dogs, brushing close enough that I felt the warmth of their bodies for a moment, before they disappeared up the incline. I waited in the parking area, pacing small, tight circles. The breeze cut across the ridge with an insistent hiss, carrying the scent of wet grass and cold stone. Whenever a radio sounded, just a burst of static or a short message, I froze. Breath catching, listening for words I prayed would come, but never did. The absence of news became a kind of pressure, heavy and constant, pushing down on the back of my neck until it felt hard to lift my head. The hours crawled. Deputies stood by their vehicles, arms crossed, shoulders hunched. A park ranger returned after a while to pull extra maps from his truck, laying them out on the hood. He marked areas with a thick pencil, the graphite making harsh, dark strokes that cut across the contour lines. Every so often he glanced up at me, offering a faint nod meant to reassure. It didn't work. They sent another team into a dense patch of brush just off the official trail. I walked near the edge of the woods as they went in, the branches swaying slightly, their leaves rattling softly like loose coins in a pocket. The group moved slowly, brushing aside tall grass with their boots lifting branches to peer beneath them, checking rock outcrops and hollows. One of them called out something about a footprint, and my heart lurched, but it turned out to be older. The edges softened by moisture, nothing that could be tied to anyone specific. The searcher shook his head gently, offering me a sympathetic look before moving on. Later, a volunteer emerged from a thicket, holding a scrap of fabric. For a moment, I willed myself to believe that it could mean something. Something small, something real. But as soon as it was inspected, the truth dropped like a stone. It was part of an old tarp someone had abandoned seasons ago. The wind tugged at the strip in the volunteer's hand, fluttering it like a loose ribbon before he folded it and tucked it into his pocket to dispose of later. I felt something twist inside me, a tight, sour feeling that sat heavy beneath my ribs. The dogs worked a long sweep along the ridge before circling back with their handlers' tongues hanging out sides, heaving from exertion. The handlers exchanged low murmurs with the supervisors, words too soft for me to catch, but their expressions told me everything. Whatever faint trail the dogs had caught near the trailhead had vanished on the open dome where the wind cut across the slopes. It made sense. Those balds could blow scent into nothing within minutes. I understood that logically. Emotionally, it landed like a blow. As the afternoon light shifted into a paler glow, a ranger pulled out binoculars and scanned the tree line below. His stance was rigid, one foot braced forward, the other planted firmly behind him as he slowly panned left to right. "Nothing moving," he said, lowering the binoculars. The words drifted into the cool air, sounding too final. A helicopter arrived late in the day. I heard it before I saw it, the distant thump of blades rolling across the mountains like an approaching storm. The rotors stirred up leaves and grit as it hovered over the ridge, its searchlight sweeping methodically across the slopes. I shielded my eyes against the spray of dust, watching that bright beam glide across patches of forest, momentarily turning dark green crowns into pale silver. Everyone watched in silence. It felt like the entire mountain had paused to observe alongside us. But the pilot reported nothing. No heat signatures, no movement, no trace of two hikers who should have been somewhere on that mountainside. When the helicopter veered off to refuel, the sudden quiet felt unnerving. The wind seemed louder, the rustle of dried grass sharper. One of the deputies approached me, hands in his pockets, voice gentler than it had been earlier. "These mountains hold on to things," he said, staring out toward the long curve of the ridge. "Sometimes longer than they should." I nodded, unable to answer. The air between us tasted faintly of dust and cold metal. As evening crept closer, whispers floated through the base area. Some volunteers speculated about a wrong turn, a side trail they might have mistaken for the main line in thick fog. Others mentioned hidden drop-offs, steep gullies where a misstep could lead to injury. A few locals leaning against their trucks exchanged quiet stories about areas off-trail where they'd stumbled upon strange things over the years, old hunting camps, scattered traps, places where they'd felt watched. Their voices lowered whenever I drifted too near, but I caught enough to know their theories weren't simple. The search expanded into deeper ravines. Teams moved into areas where the light barely reached past the canopy, their headlamps slicing thin beams through the green shadows. I followed as far as I was allowed, standing near the edges, listening to the way their voices echoed faintly from below, sharp commands softened by distance, radio crackle bouncing between tree trunks. Every echo made my stomach knot tighter. And yet, hour after hour, each returning team shook their heads. Some offered a pat on the shoulder, others a quiet word. "We'll keep at it." Still early, plenty of ground left. But their faces told a different story. A subtle clenching of the jaw, a glance exchanged between two rangers before they turned away. A volunteer rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to soothe something he couldn't put into words. Back at the makeshift command post, lanterns were lit as the light thinned. Their glow created small islands of warm yellow against the cool blue dusk. Paper cups of coffee were passed around, steam rising from the rims into the chilly air. The map on the folding table now held new marks, circles cross-hatched areas, lines drawn in pencil showing where teams had already swept. I looked at all those shaded sections and felt another sting of fear. With each area cleared, the space where he could reasonably be shrank. And yet he was nowhere. Fatigue settled over everyone like a damp blanket. Radios chimed in shorter intervals. Boots scuffed more heavily as people moved. My own legs felt like they were made of sand. I leaned against the front fender of my truck, feeling the cold metal press through my jeans, grounding me. I stared at the darkening horizon, trying to picture him somewhere out there, maybe huddled beneath a tree, maybe waiting for help. But the picture wouldn't hold. It kept slipping away, dissolving like fog under sunlight. Late in the evening, just as the last team returned to check in, a deputy walked toward the table with something held carefully in his gloved hand. His posture alone sent a ripple of unease through the group. Conversations tapered off. Even the wind seemed to quiet for a heartbeat. He spoke softly to the search coordinator, who leaned in close, brow furrowed. A pencil was lifted. A new mark was added to the map, small, precise, and far from the main trail. No one said what it was. Not yet. But I felt it through the cold air, through the steady hum of the lanterns, through the tension that threaded its way from one person to the next. Something new had been found. Something that didn't fit easily into any of the simple explanations we'd clung to all day. And as I stood there beneath the falling dusk, watching the search team gather around that new mark on the map, the ridge seemed to exhale a breath of frost across the lot, as if the mountain itself understood that whatever lay ahead was darker than any of us were prepared for. It happened on a cold morning 5 years after the search had quieted into memory. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the faint smell of stale coffee drifting up from a cup I hadn't touched when my phone buzzed against the wood. The sound was sharp, almost metallic, cutting through the stillness of the room. I answered, expecting a wrong number, maybe my sister checking in early. Instead, a ranger's low, deliberate voice filled my ear. There'd been movement caught on a remote camera deep in one of the ravines. Something unusual, something that needed my attention. The tone alone made my stomach tighten. He didn't elaborate. He just told me they were sending a vehicle. By the time the truck pulled into my driveway, thin frost clung to the edges of fallen leaves, giving the yard a brittle sheen. The ranger stepped out, collar pulled high against the cold, his eyes carrying a weight that told me he'd been holding this in since dawn. We rode in silence up toward the high country, the heater blowing warm air that did nothing to ease the pressure building between my ribs. The road wound upward through bare trees, branches tapping softly against one another like bones knocking in the wind. Neither of us spoke until the pavement gave way to gravel. Then he said almost under his breath, "We found someone." Those words lodged in my chest. My hands went cold. I couldn't speak. When we reached the staging area, the forest felt different. Still watchful, every sound wrapped in a muted hush. Rangers clustered near the edge of a steep ravine, their jackets snapping softly in the breeze. A deputy stood a little apart from the group radio in hand, listening with the kind of tense focus you only see when something unexpected enters a familiar landscape. As I approached, the wind shifted, carrying the earthy smell of damp soil and old leaves. The ranger who'd called me placed a steady hand on my shoulder before leading me forward. The climb down was slow. The dirt was soft beneath my boots, and the slope angled sharply toward a creek where the faint rush of water echoed off the rocks. As we descended, I noticed small markers tied to branches, bright strips of tape swaying gently, striking against the gray woods like tiny flags announcing a hidden truth. Then, just beyond a cluster of scrub pines, I saw it. A little structure made of poles and bark, its roof sagging, its walls patched with pieces of weathered cloth. Smoke stains darkened the rocks near the entrance. A narrow trail of footprints, bare, uneven, disappeared into the brush behind it. When the rangers called out toward the hut, a figure moved inside. The sound stopped my breath. It was slow, cautious, almost hesitant, as if whoever was in there wasn't used to the company of human voices. A man emerged, thin, bearded clothes hanging loose on his frame. His eyes flickered between the rangers, wide but unfocused, like he was trying to place the world in front of him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the creek gurgling over stones and the faint hum of the wind slipping through the ravine. Then a ranger stepped forward and gently asked his name. The man turned his head as though listening to a sound far away. He opened his mouth, once closed it again, and seemed to gather whatever strength he had left. When he finally whispered, the name came out cracked and fragile, but unmistakably real. It was Daniel's. My legs gave out beneath me. My vision blurred at the edges. I didn't hear the rangers rushing toward him or the calls for medical gear. All I could hear was a ringing in my ears, faint and high, like the sound of metal struck in another room. I grabbed onto the trunk of a nearby tree to keep myself upright, the bark rough and cold beneath my palm. Shock does strange things to the body. It makes the world feel both impossibly slow and unbearably fast, as though time has been split in half. They eased him onto a blanket, wrapping him gently, talking to him in low, steady voices. His breathing hitched whenever someone moved too quickly. When a medic checked his pulse, Daniel flinched, pulling his wrist back like a frightened animal. His skin looked as though it hadn't felt warmth in years. Up close, he smelled like wood smoke and earth with a faint sharpness beneath it that I couldn't place at the time. His eyes passed over me without recognition. There was nothing in them, not memory, not anger, not even confusion. Only a hollow kind of distance I'll never forget. Back at the trailhead, they transferred him to an ambulance. As the rear doors swung open, I saw the faint glimmer of an old scar encircling one wrist, pale against his skin. The medic blocked my view a moment later, his voice calm but firm. They needed space. They needed time. I stepped back, the cold air tightening around my lungs as the doors shut with a dull thud. The siren didn't turn on. It drifted down the mountain silently, tires crunching on gravel, leaving behind an emptiness that felt far heavier than the weight of the forest. At the hospital, everything moved with clinical precision. Doctors spoke in quiet tones, nurses adjusting IV lines, machines beeping softly with steady rhythms. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the room, hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles went white. Daniel lay in the bed, eyes half open, but not really seeing. A doctor explained the fractures, old, improperly healed, pointing to faint shadows on an X-ray like he was walking me through the layout of an unfamiliar house. There were small scars along his arms, subtle but telling, and traces of a chemical on his skin consistent with harsh pepper mixtures used in backcountry traps. Each word felt like another stone added to the weight pressing on my chest. When I was finally allowed to sit beside him, I leaned forward, my hands trembling slightly against the bed rail. His gaze drifted in my direction, then slid away again. Whatever he'd lived through had carved deep lines into his mind, dividing memory from identity, past from present. A therapist later explained that he was caught in something close to a dissociative state, his mind protecting him from memories too painful to process. But in that moment, all I saw was a man who had once known every corner of our life together, now staring past me like I was a stranger. Days passed in a blur of hospital corridors and low-lit therapy rooms. Eventually, through carefully guided sessions, using sounds and smells tied to his fragmented memories, pieces of that lost night surfaced. A harsh, stinging scent carried on the wind, a sudden burst of light in the darkness, shadows moving around their campfire, a loud metallic crack that echoed through his ribs, the feeling of being pulled, stumbling the bite of something tight around his leg, then running, or trying to. Smoke drifting low along the ground. A voice, maybe Alex's, calling out, then swallowed by chaos. Investigators matched those fragments to what they found in the ravine where the map had been marked weeks before. Burnt scraps of tent fabric caught against a fallen log. Scattered cans washed clean by time. Marks in a tree that looked like they'd been made by small, fast-moving metal. Nothing definitive, but enough to stitch together the outline of a violent encounter. They never identified who was out there that night. Illegal poachers, plant hunters guarding their territory, or someone driven by motives lost to the dark. But the signs pointed toward an outside force, one that neither he nor Alex ever saw coming. When they asked Daniel what happened to Alex, his breath faltered. His eyes filled with a quiet, unfocused terror. He tried to speak but could only manage a broken sound that made my throat close. The therapist stepped in, guiding him back to calmer ground. But even without clear words, the truth hung there in the silence Alex didn't walk away from that night. The fallout came quickly. Deputies secured the ravine. State officials arrived with clipboards and somber expressions. Reporters gathered at the base of the mountain, their camera lights flashing in the early dusk. Family members were brought into quiet rooms and given the news as gently as possible. Each conversation left a kind of echo in the halls. Soft cries, whispered prayers, the muffled thud of someone bracing against a wall. I stayed with Daniel as long as the staff allowed the rhythmic hum of the machines, creating a strange sense of calm amid the chaos. He drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes looking at me with a flicker of recognition that faded before it could take root. I kept my hand near his, not touching unless he reached first, learning the new rules of a world that no longer resembled the one we once knew. Later that night, long after visiting hours ended, I found myself in a small waiting room near the ER entrance. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale, tired glow. A deputy stepped inside, carrying a stack of folders, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air that drifted through the automatic doors. He nodded at me, then took a seat across the room, flipping open the top folder. In that quiet space, with the soft hum of the vending machine and the muted footsteps of night staff passing in the hall, the weight of what had been uncovered settled fully onto me. The truth was out. The forest had finally surrendered one of its secrets, and now we were left to face what came next. In the days that followed the discovery, everything moved with a kind of muted urgency, like the world had turned down its volume but sped up its pace. The hospital became a second home, its hallways carrying the steady hum of machines and the faint smell of disinfectant that lingered on my clothes long after I left each night. Law enforcement filtered in and out of the building, speaking in clipped phrases, exchanging files, asking quiet questions. Their boots made soft thuds on the linoleum floors, each step reminding me that this was no longer a mystery hanging in the air. It was now evidence procedure reports. Daniel's family arrived within hours of the news reaching them. His mother, Linda, walked into the hospital room with her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale, her eyes fixed on her son's face as if she didn't dare blink. She whispered his name over and over, her voice carrying the same tone she used when he was little and had fevers that frightened her. His sister stood behind her shoulders, trembling as she tried to keep herself composed. I felt both present and far away, like I was watching everything through a sheet of frost. Outside the hospital, the community reacted in waves. People in town who barely knew us dropped off casseroles, candles, cards with careful handwriting. Friends and co-workers reached out with voices thick from trying not to cry. Even neighbors I'd only waved to in passing showed up at the door holding small offerings, soup in mason jars, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. It was kindness carried on tired hands, but every gesture pierced deeper than I expected. With each knock on the door, I understood a little more how many people had been holding their breath with us. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together the fragments, the burns near the old campsite, the shot pattern in a tree trunk, the pepper residue found on Daniel's skin, the healed injuries that told the story he could not yet speak. They followed every thread, combing deeper into the ravines where illegal plant hunters worked in secret, where traps were sometimes hidden beneath leaves, where strangers moved quietly with reasons that didn't line up with park regulations. But no arrests came. No suspects stepped into the light. The forest may reveal pieces of the past, but it rarely gives names. And in the absence of someone to hold accountable, the case settled into that narrow space between open and unsolved. Officially, the file remained active. Unofficially, those who had been closer to the search knew the truth sat just beyond the edge of what could be proven. Family meetings with the sheriff's office ended in the same heavy silence every time. Diagrams were shown, timelines laid out, maps marked with circles and arrows. They explained how certain groups moved through that region, how territory was protected, how two hikers could have wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. The words were careful, tentative, like they were stepping around something sharp. My hands always tightened around the edge of the table when they spoke. I never asked for more. I don't think they could have given it if I had. For Daniel, recovery was slow and uneven. He moved through the world like someone listening to a song he almost recognized, waiting for the melody to resolve. Some days, he remembered small things, how sunlight looked on the hardwood floors of our living room, the smell of morning coffee, the way he used to tap his pen against his notebook when planning a trip. Other days, everything slipped away again, replaced by a far-off stare that made the room feel colder. When he slept, he sometimes murmured half-formed words, pieces of memories cracked in the middle. I learned to sit nearby without pushing, without asking. His trust had to regrow like moss after a storm. The town shifted around us in subtle ways. Hikers we used to see at the gear shop asked fewer questions about long routes and foggy ridges. Some trails that once felt familiar grew quiet. Folks walked in pairs more often. Weekend plans were reconsidered. The mountains hadn't changed, of course. The wind still swept across the balds the same way it always had. But people looked at them differently. Even I did. When I drove past certain trailheads, my breath tightened, and I found myself switching lanes to avoid the sight. Back at home, our routines rebuilt themselves in gentle, fragile steps. I would brew coffee in the morning, listening to the soft click of the machine, waiting for the aroma to fill the kitchen. Daniel would sit at the table, wrapped in a blanket, even when the house was warm, his fingers tracing invisible shapes on the surface. Fireplace evenings became our new anchor, the soft crackle of logs, the flicker of orange light across his face, the warmth settling into the room like a slow exhale. Sometimes he'd reach for my hand without looking, just resting his fingers lightly on mine. That small contact told me more than any sentence could. As the months passed, therapy sessions began to stitch together a clearer picture of that night. Daniel remembered flashes, the sting of something fierce in the air, the dim outline of strangers closing and the sharp snap of a trap tightening around his leg. Memories of Alex surfaced too, but they arrived as shadows, shapes without edges, grief without words. When he tried to describe them, his throat tightened and tears slid down silently. I learned to place a hand on his shoulder, light and steady, grounding him without pulling him further than he could go. For Alex's family, the absence of a body was a wound that never healed. They accepted what the evidence pointed toward, but acceptance is not the same as closure. I spent long evenings at their home, sitting in a quiet living room where framed photos lined the shelves. Alex, smiling at a lake, laughing with family during a summer barbecue, leaning over a birthday cake. His mother would press her palms together as she talked, trying to keep her voice from breaking. His father often stepped outside halfway through the conversation, standing alone in the yard, staring at nothing. Grief carved different paths through each of them. Law enforcement kept the case open for years, following rumors, checking on new activity in the backcountry, interviewing people passing through. Each lead thinned out before reaching a conclusion. Eventually, the updates arrived less frequently. Then they stopped altogether. Life moves on, but it never returns to the shape it had before. Some mornings I feel the echo of that old fear in my chest, faint but still present like a bruise beneath the skin. Certain sounds bring back memories. I wish I could lay down the crack of a fallen branch in the woods, the faint smell of smoke drifting through a cold wind, the hollow ring of metal echoing in the quiet. But there's gratitude woven into it too. Gratitude for the days when Daniel smiles without flinching, when he remembers a joke from years ago when the two of us take short walks along the river and I watch the sunlight spark on the water. Gratitude for the breath he still draws, even if each one carries the weight of what came before. I think often about the mountains, not with the same trust I once had, but with a somber kind of respect. They held on to Daniel for 5 years. They kept their secrets, even when we begged for answers. And now, whenever I stand at a high overlook or pass a trailhead at dusk, I feel something settle in the back of my throat, a reminder that nature and people both hold stories we may never fully understand. What remains after everything is a quiet truth. I learned the hard way. Survival is not just the act of coming back. It's learning how to walk through the world again with memories that sit beside you like a second shadow. Sometimes late at night, when the house is still and Daniel is asleep down the hall, I step onto the front porch. The air is cool, the street is empty, and there's a single porch light across the road glowing softly through the dark, the same light from that night years ago. It feels like a small, steady reminder that some questions will always linger, but life keeps moving one breath at a time. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.